Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have 3 scary stories to sink our hellish teeth into. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Also, if you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe and click that like button, and don't forget to tickle the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now, let's get right into it. The Corrupted Ride, posted by dependent ad 87492. Oh boy, do I want to share this story. So, something happened to me last week. So I was going for a walk, nothing personal, I just love going for weekly walks at midnight. My boyfriend called me, so I had to pick up. "AD, I stubbed my pinky toe. Is my little Spence hurt? Don't worry, I'll come home. Thank you, babe." Then he hung up. Then everything went black. A few minutes later, I wake up and I'm in some house. It was a 2-story house. Then someone said, "Do you remember Afton?" I turn around and my favourite childhood character, Toodles, from Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. "Toodles, how's it go?" "Shut it, Afton. You're here to witness all the pain we, them, all of us went through. Don't worry, we're not out for you. Just a terrifying trip down memory lane." Then he lifted his sleeves and pants to reveal cuts. "This is part 1, Afton." Then he snapped his fingers. Now I was in a 1-story house. There was a blonde boy and a red tank top guy with a mask on. Then the blonde looked at me and said, "If you want to know the truth of why we're showing you this, Afton, is 'cause memories don't last forever." Now I was in a bedroom with an animatronic. Then I heard someone say, "I know that character. Is that Leafeon?" Then another guy said, "Yes. I don't know what purpose of this animatronic is, but it looked cool." Then I mumbled, "Bros night out." Then the tough guy said, "Let's just watch some movies." Then the blonde lookalike said, "But didn't you just say..." Then the tough guy said, "Shut it." Then they went downstairs. Then the leaf animatronic said, "So, you remember this, eh?" Yeah, I do. This was high time, you know. Ready for the next one?" Sure." Then he snapped his fingers. Now I was in a suburb with someone with a kind of British voice said, "You need help, my little hellhound." "Yes, I do." "There we go. So can I get your name?" "Home of Scares, Afton, remember." Then he disappeared. "What? Okay. What's this? Memory?" Then in the distance I heard, "Hello, Tom." I looked, and there was this clean-suited woman with a male's voice. Then I warped into the basement with fucking 10 dead bodies. What? Wait. You shouldn't be here. Then he pushed me and I teleported to a bar with the same guy and the same clean-suited woman. He, she, it said, "It will not save this cruel world, Toodles." Then I warped to the bedroom with that Tom guy talking to an angel. Then for the last time for this memory, I warped in the middle of nowhere. Then the suited woman and the Tom guy were fighting. Then I remembered. The dealer from hell. I mumbled. Well, finally you remember. Satan, fucking Lucifer. Is that your way of saying Jesus Christ? Yes, but that doesn't matter. All that matters that this guy gets to the next memory. Then he snapped his fingers. Now, I was in a pizzeria and there was fighting in the dining area. I went over and said, "What's going on? You know these two?" I looked and saw Homeofscares yelling at Gamma Akutabi. Gamma? Hey Afton. You can get to your memory realization once this rival of mine leaves. I'll leave alright. Then I warped to the second door of the office. I knew this was Five Nights at Freddy's, but I didn't know what the memory was. Then the Leaf animatronic was back, but he was outside the office window. Freddy's Winter Pizza's dark secret. Good, one more memory to go. Then he snapped his fingers for the last time. This is the final memory. I was in a studio of some sort, mixed with a house. Then a Springtrap version of Clyde, the Discord logo, came from the front door. Then I got the final memory, the creepy animatronic and the twisted Discord animatronic. Good job. Now time to go back to your life. Then everything went black. I woke up at the hospital. My boyfriend was beside the bed in tears. AD. I hugged him and the doctors let us go home. So that's my story. I'm writing this story because Spencer is the last guy I want to share this story with. What? I drowned my wife in the bathtub. Posted by Toucan the Rapper. When we got married, my wife had no toes. I am starting here because, with God as my witness, I have no idea how else to begin this. That's the thing. I don't even know what it is. Account? Confession? Obituary? I had to write something down. I've taken photos, but nobody would believe she wasn't born. No. Stop skipping ahead. Clarity. Benedict. Clarity. Start at the beginning. When I married Emily, she had no toes. I married her because of her eccentricities, her stories and her tall tales. I'd always laugh them off, especially the one about how she'd lost the digits on her feet. I'd always seen it as a fanciful way of explaining away a birth defect. It never bothered me, but Emily grew up in an orphanage, and of course, kids can be cruel. I'd always assumed the beach tale was a way to keep old wounds closed. I realised now that I was naive. According to Emily, she had been walking the beach at Dovercourt, a bleak and run-down shipping town on the UK's east coast. It was before her parents' accident, so she can't have been older than 4. She'd been digging for shark teeth when she found, about a foot below the pebbles and grey sand, a sea slug. This is where the tale took one of Emily's usual flights of fancy, because, you see, this wasn't just any sea slug. Throughout our marriage, she had sworn on her parents' graves that the moist creature was the exact size, shape, texture and colour of a human tongue. She even defiantly refused to budge on her assertion that it moved and writhed in her hands exactly like one too. The Emilyism that made me write off the story as fiction for years was what it did after a few minutes of wriggling. According to the wife, I'd give anything to hold again. The tongue slug vanished in her hands, disappeared into thin air with no sound or commotion. There one moment, gone the next. You're probably wondering how this relates to her toes though. Well, the tale of the tongue slug ends when 4-year-old Emily awoke the next morning to find they were missing. Her parents found the screaming toddler in a bed with severed toes and pools of blood nowhere to be found. The flesh on her feet simply ended, much to her parents' and doctors' confusion, in smooth, blemishless stumps, like the toes were never there at all. Of course, for years I thought the joke was that they never had been. Thinking about the fact that Emily wasn't joking at all still sends a shiver down my spine. It started during the last COVID-19 lockdown. Just like Emily's parents, I was awoken by screaming, sobs. Emily was on the floor. She had fallen out of bed, and I could see why straight away. I wish I was man enough to have leaped from the bed, scooped her up and rushed her to the nearest hospital. If I wasn't such a coward, maybe I would have, and none of this would have happened. Instead, all I could do was sit up in bed and scream with her. Her calves were missing. There was no gaping wound or exposing bone from a grisly severing, no pools of blood or shredded tissue. They were simply gone. Emily's knees are now smooth globes at the end of her thighs. I can feel them. I can feel them. I can feel them. I have never heard a person yell like that. Her voice cracked and broke like there was so much panic in her lungs that her throat wasn't strong enough to contain it. I'm embarrassed to admit how long it took me to calm down. so I won't. Once I had, I clambered down from the bed and sat behind her. I held Emily in my arms for about 3, maybe 4 hours. I only found out I'd spent that long silently sobbing into her auburn hair. Later though, when I crashed downstairs on the faux leather couch that afternoon. When you love somebody and they're that terrified, time becomes irrelevant. Any mother sat at a bedside in a neonatal ICU will tell you this. I sat and rocked her across those hours, telling her to focus on my breathing, despite it being far from steady or calm. We got there though, somehow. She was sobbing throughout, me helping her dress. I tried to let her maintain her dignity, do as much for herself as she could, but I found myself overstepping almost every boundary she had. At one point, she actually told me to frick off. Not her actual word, obviously. I'd never heard her swear before. She couldn't explain what she meant, what she'd said. I can feel them, until I'd carried her downstairs and sat her on the sofa. We'd watch a documentary on phantom limb syndrome once. It's when amputees get itches they can't scratch on limbs that are no longer there. Emily made it clear in a plain and matter-of-fact tone, free of any panic or confusion, that as far as her body was concerned, nothing was out of place. When she had woken up that morning, she thought she or I had wet the bed. From the shins down, all she could feel was warm liquid. The strangest part, the part that had shocked her so much she launched herself out of the bed, was that she could feel her toes again. After I came round from my exhaustion nap, we had a long talk. I begrudgingly accepted no doctors would be phoned. Emily made the final decision, of course. I begged her to let me take her to the hospital, but she refused point blank. Her argument was bulletproof. Legs don't just disappear. They just don't. The best case scenario was the doctor couldn't do anything. Worst case, well, we'd both watched enough of the X-Files to know people experiencing inexplicable limb vanishing don't spend long outside of military or government captivity. The thought of Emily on a cold steel medical table being dissected by men in hazmat suits was enough to get me to forget seeking professional help. In the end, Emily did make one concession. I called Shane, a colleague and the closest thing I had to a friend locally. I couldn't tell him the specifics over the phone for obvious reasons, but my caginess piqued his curiosity and he agreed to come over. He didn't scream, which was a relief. At first he laughed, then he smacked his tongue on the roof of his mouth. Then finally, once the colour had drained from his spray-tan face, he sat down. "Can I have a glass of water?" he eventually managed to ask, eyes not moving from the empty space where he knew his colleague's wife's legs had been a few months ago at the Christmas party. Shane, I'd worked with him for years. I should never have called him. He didn't deserve to die. People react to the unexplainable in different ways. Some panic, others stay calm and take no action. Once we'd fully explained our mourning to him, Shane had been the latter. That's why I had to kill him. For once, my absent-mindedness came in handy. If I hadn't left the hammer on the mantelpiece after putting the new shelf up 3 days ago, it wouldn't have been within easy reach. If it wasn't within easy reach, Shane would have finished dialing 999. If he had finished dialing 999, Emily would have been carted away to some test facility and I would be alone. Frick that. I didn't choose the sharp end of the hammer on purpose, nor did I intentionally drive the thin wedge right into Shane's temple. I was acting too much on instinct to have planned that thoroughly. The surge of adrenaline had streamlined my inner voice into a caveman grunt that simply meant hit, kill. I dropped the dripping tool the moment I realised what I'd just done. I fell to my knees and wept. Once again, a 5-year-old lost in a supermarket. Emily wasn't sobbing or screaming or yelling or making any sounds of distress. She was laughing. Sweet Mary of Bethlehem, Benedict Boxted, who thought you had it in you? Then I was laughing too, still on my knees, face still wet with tears, but laughing all the same. Seems messed up now, I'm writing it down. My newly legless wife and I bent double in near hysterics while an innocent estate agent leaked all over the floorboards. Panicking wouldn't have helped, and the looming despair was so thick neither of us would find our way back if we ventured into it. Laughter was the only sensible option. Lucky Shane was a frick boy whose family lived way up in Manchester. Emily mused as I wrapped his body in black bin liners. You only called, right? Didn't message. By the time they came looking for him, there'll be no way to trace it to us. Just make sure you dump your phone. For all her qualities, Emily wasn't smart. For all my faults, many stem from not being the sharpest knife on the rack. That's why I didn't question this now quite obviously ridiculous assertion that no police would come asking around. Even if I had been blessed with a bit more brains though, I was too lost in a barely suppressed panic to notice. That's also the reason I didn't fully register the second time I ever heard Emily not use the word frick. Disposing of Shane was a pain in the backside. Emily couldn't help for obvious reasons. A person with no feet isn't much help when dragging the body of a grown man into your back garden. She did sit by the kitchen window after I had the genius idea of repurposing my office chair and a broom handle into a makeshift wheelchair she could punt around on, and I was appreciative of the company as I went about my first dark deed of the next few months. The conversation made digging and filling the hole much quicker, plus I'd always felt planting flowers was a group activity. Petunias are better enjoyed with friends. The next week was strange. Emily did 1 or 2 Zoom meetings, but eventually signed off sick from her trendy marketing job. The team would cope without a lead, she'd informed her stammering underlings. laptop poised on her shinless thighs. It was on the morning of the next Saturday, exactly 7 days from the calf incident, that we took our next step on the descent into madness. I was once more awoken by hysterics from Emily's side of the bed. This time it wasn't crying though. This time it was laughter, the same kind of maniacal giggling she had let loose after I removed Shane from the equation with my dad's old hammer. Still half asleep, I rolled over to see what the joke was. The second round of hysterics was from me, and they very much were filled with sobs, screams, and scrambling away from the woman who shared my bed. My wife had no legs. Her hips ended as the same fleshy, perfect orbs her now vanished knees had been when we'd gone to sleep the night before. To my growing alarm, Emily wasn't at all perturbed by this. Hey, she managed to get out between excited giggles. I did say I wanted to lose weight. She was waving her hand through the air where her thighs had once been. My heart thumped in my chest. What was happening to my wife? And why did she seem so happy about it? Still, the change meant I didn't have to carry her around the house, at least. Without the extra weight of her thighs, her arms, now strengthened by a week of office chair punting, were more than capable of functioning as standing legs. She'd walk around the house on her palms, laughing softly to herself when she thought I couldn't hear. When I asked her once what was so funny, she simply rolled her eyes and said, "Don't worry, it's nothing you've done. Something's just tickling the back of my knees. Calm the frick down." I couldn't calm the frick down. Firstly, because again, she didn't say frick. And secondly, because how was I supposed to be calm when my wife's legs had disappeared with no explanation? Look, Benny, it's okay. I can still feel them, but it's just phantom limb syndrome. Just like that frickin' show. It took an hour for her to properly explain, mainly because she'd break into more fits of laughter every few minutes. It took another 2 for me to properly calm down. There was a clear reason too. I knew my Emily, and I knew when she wasn't being honest. She didn't believe what she was telling me. To her, this wasn't phantom limb syndrome. In her mind, wherever her legs had gone, they were still with her, still attached to her solid flesh and bone. After how the next few weeks played out, I'm not sure I'd argue with her on that if she'd have just come out and said it. Not anymore. I spent until the following Wednesday morning trying to make sense of it all, but then the doorbell rang. I don't know why I let him in the house. When the 20-something Jehovah's Witness asked to come in and speak about Jesus, I was too dazed and quietly terror-stricken to fully realise what I'd agreed to when I said yes. This time the hammer strike was deliberate. He had been mid-psalm when the metal wedge connected with the back of his skull. The O in the word hope prolonged and slurred as he crumbled in slow motion, finishing the vowel as a twitching heap on the floorboards. I'd only just scrubbed the blood out. The wet thud of the hammer collapsing, The suburban missionary's head had been loud enough to bring Emily knuckling down the stairs. At least I wasn't weeping this time. She found me stood over the body, quite calm, cleaning the Jehovah's Witness blood off the blunt tool with a wet wipe. I was beyond terrified by my own actions. By this point, you see, I'd fully disassociated, I think. I was lost, somewhere behind my eyes, screaming impotently at reality to stop and reverse back to before I answered the door. The argument that followed was the worst and definitely the weirdest we'd ever had. She didn't talk to me through the window this time. I had to dig a second hole next to Shane's flower bed in silence, left alone while Emily sat by the upstairs window to keep an eye on the confused looking religious door knockers peering through front windows all along the street. I could hear her laughing as I dug, angry cackles which she made no attempt to hide. It was all a frickin' detour, eh? All a distraction. Pointless prelude. I practically flew through the bedroom door. I'd come in for a glass of water when I'd heard the sound of her shrill ramblings coming down the stairs. The sounds of distress had shaken the kitchen ceiling. No, not distress. Distress was what I started feeling about halfway up the stairs. Emily's shrieking shook the walls of the hallway. She was screaming about I don't know what, laughing hysterically between every sentence. I'll be with you soon. I'll be with you soon. Tell the man in charge I'm coming. When the door slammed open, she shot upright on her windowsill perch, jumping out of her skin. She looked sheepishly at me, biting her lip to suppress the occasional giggle. Emily, I asked, my voice unsure. Sorry, huh? She mumbled. I dozed off. Must have been having a bad dream. Again, I knew her well enough to know that she believed none of those words. I didn't have the time or courage to confront her though. My sweaty palms had more petunias to plant. The next few weeks were a paranoid blur. Well, for me at least. I don't think Emily was aware of very much beyond the changes in her body after the Jehovah incident. I decided it wasn't safe for me to take my attention away from her too long, so I took some sick leave. COVID-19 was a great cover-up. It would have been hard to explain if we both were expected in the office. I spent my nights at the window, taking long vigils with the lights out, peering through the blinds and hoping nobody came to claim the guests sleeping under my petunias. The funny thing is, hey, we think the children are safe. They're the worst of all of us. She knew the truth though. She wrote it down. They call him every year. They call him every year. And when all's said and done, the town's graveyard just gets fuller. The man in charge can't wait to me. He's very angry with you though. No, he's not happy with you at all, Benny. It took me a few days to get used to the dark, unnerving things Emily would holler and giggle into the dark bedroom when I had to head out to use the loo or start the next watch at the window. Trying to hold a stable conversation with her was pointless now. Not that I didn't try. Are you hungry? Hungry? Huh. My Thyrathorax, the 8-armed maggot prince, is hungry. The people lost in the pocket dimension of the non-things are hungry. You've never been hungry, Benny. You don't know what hungry is. Even the most basic questions eventually led to an incomprehensible babbling. I learned to look past it. She ate the meals I gave her, after all. What did it matter if I couldn't present them without being paid in mind-curdling titters that made sleep impossible most nights? My legs, my feet, my tail. My legs, my feet, my tail. My legs, my feet, my tail. The next change was too much for Emily, I think. What little sanity had remained was gone when I awoke on the morning of the next disappearance. The shoulders, breasts and head that were once my wife rattled the same words over and over again, her eyes rolling back in her hair, her expression terrified. She didn't even notice me pick her up and put her in the cupboard. The towels and the kitchen roll I wedged in the cracks of the old door did little to quiet the noise. If we were the kind of couple that owned a ball gag, I would have used it, but the rolled up pair of socks would have to do. It didn't seem like she minded as I shut the door, tears streaming down my face. It didn't seem like she was aware of anything but her legs, her feet, her tail. I tried not to dwell on that last one too much while I placed seeds and fertilizer over the Shane and Jehovah mounds. The petunias were wilting, and wilting flowers raised suspicion, I told myself. Neighbours can be nosy. It was best to be careful. That sensible reasoning was why I hit Shane's mother with the hammer when she turned around to shut the front door behind her. I, of course, had the hammer ready when I opened the door. I'm not an idiot. My aim was good as ever. I was also relieved to have something to occupy my time. Upstairs, Emily had managed to dislodge the socks and tenderly planting fresh petunias on the new mound next to Shane's was a good distraction to occupy myself for the rest of the day. The police showed up 2 days later. Yesterday, so you have context. I had bigger problems by then, though. When I woke yesterday morning, the room was quiet. It took me a few seconds to realise the gentle lull of birdsong wasn't a welcome event. The fact I could hear it meant the hysterical shrieks and cackles from the cupboard had stopped. I know what you're thinking. Surely that was a good thing. Well, it would have been if the soft chuckles and whispers that replaced them weren't far, far worse. You know, I'm so glad I'm not like you, Benny. I'll get to munch, munch, munch and crunch, crunch, crunch while I watch your skin melty melts and the shit in your bowels boils until you burst. When the man in charge meets you, he's going to take your eyes, Benny. He's going to burn you for 1,000 years, but you'll never die. That's what he wants with all of you, Benny, all you scumlings and filthy smalls. and screamy squashes. I'm going to eat them all, Benny, when I get there. I'm going to eat all of them. All the people. I'm going to eat you too, Benny. You're going to get there eventually with the rest of the underscum. And when you do, I'm going to eat you over and over and over. And when your brains ooze out your ear holes because I've crunched down on your skull, do you know what I'm going to do, Benny? I'm going to touch myself. It took me 5 hours of listening to those sanity-breaking promises before I had the nerve to open the door. Emily's head sat on a cushion of auburn hair as the back of the cupboard. Her green eyes rolled back, bulging from their sockets. Her cheeks were red as an open blister, brow coated in a thin layer of sweat that matched my own, and flecks of spittle exploded from her mouth as she whispered, "I'm ready, Benny. I'm ready, and I'm going soon. I can't wait to meet the man in charge. He'll satisfy more than you ever have, Benny." She wasn't laughing much anymore. She was panting softly, breaths from wherever her lungs had gone, or whatever they now were, coming through fast and shallow, the disembodied head of my wife whispering pure nightmare fuel. Wasn't what made me collapse onto the bedroom carpet and vomit, though. No, it was the voice she spoke with which did that. The whispers reaching my head through unknown mental avenues outside of my ears weren't Emily's. They weren't even human. The syllables came from a battery of voices, each at least an octaves higher than the last, all except one, a single bass tone, almost too low to comprehend, that danced in and out of the cascade of degrading noise. The language, the mother tongue of Emily's screeching monologue as it rattled around my skull, I did not recognize. It was no language of this earth, yet, to my horror, I understood every word. "Soon I'll be free, Benny. Soon I'll be free, and you'll see me again in 3 years, 9 months, 4 days, 7 hours, 42 minutes, and 17 seconds. Then you'll see how I munch, and crunch, see who was really inside the filthy small you married." The rest happened on autopilot. The subconscious taunting whispers didn't stop when I picked up the gibbering head. They remained uninterrupted as I carried her into the bathroom and placed her gingerly on a towel I'd placed on the toilet seat. She'd continued her foul declarations for every minute it took for the ceramic tub to fill with warm water. That's how I knew I still loved her. I made sure it wasn't too hot or too cold, and even added some bubble bath before I picked up her still whispering head and plunged it under the surface. Human beings can only survive with lungs full of water for a few minutes. Emily's lips didn't stop moving until she'd been under there for at least 2 hours. I held her temples, tears falling non-stop from my eyes as they remained fixed on her bulging, rolling ones. That is, until they too disappeared. Before the final 10 or so minutes, the rest of Emily's head dematerialized. I nearly slipped face first into the bathwater. The auburn eels of hair worming between my white knuckles vanished. I yelled, brushing aside the bubbles. Only one trace of Emily remained. Plump lips, white teeth, and a waggling tongue, somehow set into a flat piece of skin much shallower than the depth of the mouth it contained, a mouth that was still moving. I rammed my fist into it. In the end, I grabbed that tongue and pulled as hard as I could, anything to stop the whispers. The water did nothing to dull. A deep crimson bloomed beneath the bubbles. The hard biting at my wrist stopped. I wrenched my arm out of the water, holding a single piece of flesh in my grasp. It was a tongue, a blood-soaked, wriggling tongue, unlike the rest of Emily. There was a wound where it had left her body. The horror at what I'd done slowly dawned on me. I sat alone on the cold tiles, my wife's limp and severed tongue in my hands, and howled. I stayed there, curled in the fetal position next to the bathtub, full of my wife's blood, until the police started hammering at the door about 20 minutes ago. The tongue had gone limp, but hasn't vanished. The mouth has though. Emily has gone, leaving me alone and frightened, with the police about to break down the door and find me with the severed tongue of my missing wife and 3 bodies buried in my back garden. The thing is, after the last few months, prison doesn't seem so scary. That's why I was calm enough to write all this out. I knew I had to tell my side of the story. Let's be real, once that battering ram I can hear finally does its job, that's it for me. You'll be hearing about me on the news. The talking heads will tell you I'm a serial killer, a hard-boiled psychopath, refusing to reveal the location of my wife's body. I'm going to tell them the truth, but they won't believe it. You and I know better though. You now know, like I do, that there isn't a body. You'll know, as they put me behind bars for life, that I'm only guilty of 3 of the 4 murders next to my name on Wikipedia. You'll know, like I do, that I am a 25% innocent man. You'll also know the nagging truth that I think is going to keep me up for many nights to come. Emily had told me when I'd see her again in 3 years, 9 months, 4 days, 4 hours, 12 minutes and 32 seconds, that when I saw her I'd meet the man in charge. That's when, according to Emily, all of her maddening promises would be fulfilled. She could have just been taunting me, teasing me, trying to see just how blatant the untruths she could fill my head with, where before I snapped. I don't think that's the case though. Besides, over the years I knew my wife. Before I drowned her in my bathtub, she told a lot of tall tales, starting with a particularly tall one about her missing toes. I'm starting to think that maybe her tall tales weren't so tall after all. Why has nobody heard of the Chewy-Man? Posted by Toucan the Rapper. This is the 874th online community I've tried. Hopefully this will be the last. Terry told me about this place. Told me you guys have experience with weird stuff. The Chewy-Man isn't the only weird thing out there, I'm sure. I know from the Bigfoot and UFO forums that every inexplicable or paranormal phenomenon has its storm chasers. I've got my fingers crossed that here this post finds someone, anyone, who might be able to shed some light on just what the heck is going on in my small town. As with every forum I've visited, I come with a simple question. Why has nobody heard of the Chewy-Man? My posts have racked up millions of views, reads, likes, whatever internet currency you pick. I've been on hardcore cryptid forums, 4chan, the message boards of paranormal investigators, websites. I've even spent 1 or 2 drunk nights asking on sites like Mumsnet or in Amazon reviews for random products. Not that these ones last long before getting taken down. Even my Tor browser ventures into the dark web turned up empty. Over the last 20 years or so, I have asked, inquired, harassed, begged and hassled almost every corner of the internet trying to find answers. Nobody has heard of him. Nobody has heard of the Chewy-Man. That's the problem. We know he's real, and our ragtag friendship group of 6 teenage lads can't be the only people that have seen him. I've gone over that night on loop throughout every one since. Every detail, no matter how small, is burned into my memory, kept in clarity by endless mental reinvestigation of those there. Only Terry and I remain, invested in knowing the truth. Rob allegedly killed himself a few months ago. The schizophrenia he'd struggled with ever since finally breaking him. Both Dan and Ricky took sides with the rest of the town. As for Greg, no, I'll get to Greg. You need to know about the Chewy-Man before I tell you why I'm so desperate to find out about him. It started with a ritual, one of those silly games teenagers play to summon, well, no, to spook themselves. That's usually the intent, isn't it? The Chewy-Man rituals was different. It was clear the girls in the grainy footage were much more committed to whatever they thought would happen than saying Bloody Mary 5 times in a mirror. We'd never heard of the Chewy-Man before. We found the battered VHS tape under Greg's dad's bed. That's why the words one of the girls said into the camera when we pressed play were confusing. Hi, Christy here. Obviously, you guys have all heard of the Chewy-Man. We hadn't. A quick muttering amongst the 6 of us confirmed that the name Chewy-Man meant nothing. Christy in the video continued, speaking under the assumption that any viewers would be aware of the Chewy-Man, and that was to come next. Now you guys know the rhyme, I'm sure. Again, nothing but shrugs from our group, but we found out there's a hidden, secret part. No, I'm not talking about the symbols Mike Eastley copied from that book in the library. Duh. That's like so old news. Christy stood to the side and gestured behind her. A lump started to rise in my throat. I squirmed on my cushion in front of the TV, increasingly uncomfortable as the realization dawned that the old VHS labelled CM87 may not give us the kind of thrills 14-year-olds expect from tapes under their mate's dad's bed. The blonde girl in the bright pink t-shirt and denim dungarees had moved to reveal the room behind her. She had 3 friends with her, other girls dressed similarly in late 80s fashion. The small room must have been somebody's attic or basement. Exposed plaster, wiring, pipes and timber beams lined the walls. The camera wasn't positioned to give a good view of the ceiling, judging by the angles of the girls' long shadows on the bare wood floorboards. The cramped space was lit only by a single grimy bulb suspended somewhere out of shot. 2 of them were drawing something on those floorboards. If you're expecting a pentagram or some other satanic looking symbolism, I'm going to have to disappoint you. The girls, one in a leather jacket and the other wearing leggings with an oversized The Cure t-shirt, were using a set of large rulers, protractors and compasses to mark the deliberate angles and curves with green chalk. The Fibonacci sequence of spirals within spirals must have taken them hours. They were putting on the finishing touches at the time. Christy pressed record. The pattern stretched about 15 foot in diameter easily. The neon emerald chalk lines seemed to glow almost, their brightness a step above the other dim grains of the footage. Christy smirked at the camera. Steph and Becky have been working at this all day. That's how we know Mike Eastley is full of crap. Like he could focus on anything outside his pants for more than an hour. One of the girls piped up as she finished her chalk circle. The rest of them laughed. That is, except for the girl in the school uniform, standing over something off camera at the far left of the screen, half hidden in the shadows. Christy wiped a reed of laughter before continuing. Right, anyway, we checked out that book. You want to see the real Chewy-Man ritual? Keep watching. Oh, and Mike Eastley can suck it. The wild-eyed blonde winked at the camera on the other side of the screen. The 6 of us watched with bated breath. The tension was palpable. Terry and I both have since tried to work out what prompted the growing sense we were about to see something far darker than we could handle. This was the days before the internet, but fake found footage videos of supernatural nonsense weren't unheard of in the last year of the 90s, especially since Blair Witch was released. I can't explain why, but instinctively we could tell this was different. If only we'd known how different. Maybe Rob would still be with us. Maybe Greg. No, we'll get to Greg. Despite the lumps in our throat and a quiet whimper from Dan, nobody decided to reach forward and stop the video. Teenage boys are like that. On screen, Christy, Becky and Steph were standing around the circle. The girl in the school uniform still faced away in the shadows, ignoring the trio and remaining intently focused on whatever she was guarding off the screen. In unison, the trio around the circle raised their arms towards the centre. They were holding something they'd been carrying in their back pockets. That's corn syrup, Dan stammered. Back in the then present. Yeah, it must be, Terry had replied, not believing Dan or himself, still putting it in. Condoms is freaky as hell. Each of the girls was indeed holding a condom. The rubbers were filled with a dark red liquid, dangling and swaying on an unseen breeze from knots pinched between long pastel nails. Terry and I both agreed that given what we know now, it probably wasn't corn syrup. The girls stood in silence for about 30 seconds, then speaking with the unity that can only be achieved by old friends, reciting playground rhyme, they started chanting, Chewy-Man, Chewy-Man, come around for tea. Chewy-Man, Chewy-Man, come out for me. Chewy-Man, Chewy-Man, bad kids should pack. Chewy-Man, Chewy-Man, out for a snack. Again and again they chanted the unfamiliar nursery rhyme. They did so with the same practiced clarity with which anyone could deliver Mary Had a Little Lamb or London's Burning. We conferred as they sang on, their chanting voices almost merging into a singular, monotonous drone. Have you heard of it, Ricky? You've not heard of it either, right? Right? Nah, my dad grew up here too. They've got local accents, for Pete's sake. It must be fake. Chewy-Man. Obviously a made up name. And so on. Fear was slowly taking hold of our teenage minds, yet still none of us thought to end the nightmare by pressing a small dark grey square on the stop button. With nobody to resist, the VHS played on. Natural pops and crackles of the audio seemed to grow sharper, more pronounced. The glowing of the chalk spirals intensified, moving further from harmless optical illusions and towards inexplicable but real phenomenon. Shadows in those parts of the attic or basement furthest from the circle deepened. Those cast by the three girls around the glowing chalk grew longer, darker, stretching and solidifying until there was no space of floorboard untouched by either an absence of light or the impossible green luminescence on the floor diagram. My heartbeat and arithmetic hammering against my ribs, cold beads of sweat began to trickle down my forehead. The girl in the school uniform was heading into the circle, dragging the thing she'd been guarding. It was a boy, only a few years older than the six of us. Uneven wisps of beard patched his clammy face, the protruding Adam's apple on his neck bobbing and spasming as he tried to scream through the gag made of two filthy socks rammed down his throat. He was considerably larger than the girl in the school uniform. This didn't seem to faze her though, and she showed no signs of strain as she dragged him to the centre of the room by his curly, blood-matted hair. Once he lay in a whimpering heap in the centre of the diagram, the uniformed girl retreated back to the edges of the shot. She faced inwards now, bright-eyed and smirking, The obvious hunger and anticipation in her expression turned my stomach almost as much as the bruises and cuts on the sobbing boy's face. The other girls continued chanting, their pace quickening and enthusiasm now unrestrained. Chewy-Man, come round for tea. Chewy-Man, come out for me. Chewy-Man, bad kids should pack. Chewy-Man, out for a snack. Their chants rose in volume, the pitches and tones converging into indistinguishable noise. The words blurred and melted into each other. The screen started flickering on every syllable, the grain of both the footage and the audio pulsing in time to the rhythm of their endless rhyming. It felt like it went on for hours. The loud, wet crack made all 6 of us watching yell and scramble back from the TV a few inches. On a cue known only to them, the droning trio raised their arms in a single movement. They threw the blood-filled condoms at the circle's centre. Dan yelped again, and a quick glance confirmed his face was covered in tears. Terry, Ricky, Rob and Greg had gone quiet. I can't remember my own reaction, but I know it was closer to Dan's than it was the others. The 3 condoms ruptured on the glowing chalk. Their dark red contents splattered both the ground and the sobbing boy. At the sharp crack of the rubber splitting, the screen flickered, going fully white or black on a few almost indetectable frames. The young man struggled and screamed into the socks. It was at that moment I realised he must have been drugged. His face was panicked, eyes bulging and leaking tears, but the movement of his limbs was slow and rubbery, despite us screaming at the TV for him to move. He remained in place on the chalk and now blood-covered floorboards. We didn't have long to plead with him. By the time the chalk spirals started moving, all words or fearful utterances caught in my throat, my brain finding it impossible to make sense of the information sent to it through retinal lenses and optical nerves. I'd seen those girls mark out those now aggressively glowing spirals, circles and lines. Their intricate pattern wasn't some set piece or optical illusion. It was a normal, ordinary, and above all stationary chalk drawing etched out on normal, ordinary, and above all solid hardwood floorboards. The diagram didn't care. Despite the dread-fueled knot in my gut, the maze of delicate spirals and deliberate angles started shifting across the dusty wood. The iridescent sequences danced together with a disturbing harmony, rotating and gliding on their own orbital paths, and yet, somehow, their trajectories never crossed. The bruised and bloodied boy at their centre screamed into his gag, louder than ever before. If I weren't so terrified, I'd have joined in. The flailing of his rubbery limbs reached peak levels of deliberateness and urgency, yet it wasn't enough to move him more than a few inches. Even with the glowing, spinning spirals, that was a clear catalyst to his renewed efforts, one it took me no longer than half a second to catch. The blood from the condoms was bubbling and trickling along the wood, oozing and ebbing with an obvious purpose. My terrified psyche could not hide from me. As I said, by this point I was too scared to scream. The boy in the video wasn't though. he howled and shrieked into the ball of filthy cloth, never stopping his futile attempts to edge himself away from the puddle of sentient crimson liquid forming inches from his face. Dan's wailing was uncontrollable. Ricky had to keep telling him to shut up, but the quivering in his voice betrayed his own inability to process the situation. Greg was pleading with us not to think his dad was some kind of pervert. Terry, Rob and I continued watching with lumps in our throats and tears in our eyes, saying nothing. If we'd have known this was our last chance to stop the tape before, well, you'll see. Suffice to say, if we'd had known what was to come, what that bubbling pool of blood was about to do, in the last few innocent seconds, one of us would have pressed the dark grey square. Unfortunately, we didn't, and now nobody will admit Greg or his dad ever existed. If only I'd have listened to my gut, to the screaming instincts urging me to reach forward and stop the tape. I ignored them though. That single decision not to act changed everything forever. If I'd have stopped the tape then, we'd never have had to witness the Chewy-Man. It started with the puddle of murky crimson liquid, the pool of undiluted and spasmed, growing until it was itself a perfect circle within the rotating chalk spirals. By the time it stopped, it was a full 7 foot across, much wider than it should have been given the amount of blood that was in the Johnnies. To my growing horror, the bubbling on the viscous surface grew more violent by the second. Thick red steam started billowing from the hissing gore slick, tainting the greens and shadows of the video with hues of maroon. The only sounds coming from the tiny speakers on the TV were the boys' muffled whimpers and the organic hissing of the boiling blood puddle. The girls stopped chanting suddenly in perfect unison, none amongst them chanting alone for even a nanosecond. The spirals hadn't stopped their graceful rotations. However, they continued to shimmer and glide along the floorboards, throwing eerie pale lights over the girls and their captive. Then, quietly at first, but after a few minutes, a crescendo of pained moans. We heard him, the Chewy-Man. The bubbles on the surface carried muted grunts and cries of agony when they popped. My eyes widened as the first of his hands pushed up through the boiling crimson. It was long. The two flat fingers and thumb splayed from the dinner plate sized palm, measured at least a foot from missing knuckles to each yellow splintered fingernail. I couldn't see any joints, no indication of bones of any sort. Instead, both the first flabby appendage and the twin that followed flapped and grasped at the floorboards around the puddle with pulsing, anemone-like movements. The boy on the floor, we 6 observers in then present, and the 2 girls who weren't Christy or the freak in the school uniform were screaming. Only Christy and the uniformed girl weren't absolutely terrified by the sight of those vine-like rubbery arms emerging from the crimson puddle. For her part, Christy eyed the purplish limbs hungrily as they contracted and dilated, pulling the Chewy-Man's grotesque body from whatever infernum existed on the other side of the pool's violent surface. She was laughing as the first signs of its damp, glistening crown broke through to the world only the rational and the sane are supposed to occupy. "That's what you get, Mike Eastley," she snarled at the limp, sobbing boy on the floor. "That's what you get for dumping me, just because I kept it at second base." I'd have found her unrestrained anger at the helpless boy horrifying, were it not for the girl in the uniform. Unlike Becky and Steph, one of whom was retching up the contents of her lunch, at the sight of the quivering lump emerging from the floor, the nameless girl was calm. Her breaths remained steady as she beheld the Chewy-Man's stomach-churning form for the first time, her expression locked in a predatory, narrowed-eyed grin. The Chewy-Man's sunken eyes weren't bright and electric like Christie's or the uniformed girls, nor were they wide and fearful like Becky, Steph, the gagged Mike Eastley, or my friends and I. The Chewy-Man's shriveled orbs were a disturbing mixture of angry, upset, and hateful, a pained, haunting look I imagined exists nowhere else but in the eyes of unwell mothers before they drown their own children in bath water. The irisless pupils were set into a brow that looked almost human, save for the complete absence of a nose and the disproportionately small eyeballs. The only indication the crown of that boneless body wasn't human lay in the overly convex angle of its ridge. The noseless lower half of the face, however, was impossible to cognitively link with any branch of the Homo genus. There were no neck, jaws, or ear. The top of the Chewy-Man's head simply melted into the broad, unmuscular shoulders. Its mouth, twisted and framed by puckered lips, ran from armpit to deflated armpit. The dozens of irregular rows of teeth within stuck out at painful angles from the gums. Speaking of, each quivering tooth-lined ridge was at least as thick as my forearm. I had to convince myself that I couldn't smell that purplish rubbery thing by the time it had pulled enough of its torso out of the puddle to reach Mike Eastley. Unfortunately for my sanity, it was confirmed for me within a few moments that the pungent stench of rotting fish and discarded medical waste was definitely not in my imagination. That's when the speakers on the TV started leaking. A thick, viscous brown liquid began to ooze from the tiny holes in the silver plastic. I yelled, and Greg ran off to grab a roll of tissue or a wipe or something to get rid of the sewage-like discharge pooling around the TV. I think Dan had passed out by then. Rob was an inconsolable, spluttering mess on the floor. Only Terry, Ricky and I had the fortitude to try and contain the fluid and its nauseating fumes. It was difficult though. Despite our terror, the events unfolding on the screen were proving impossible to look away from. The Chewy-Man was getting to work. As the speakers spluttered and spat that reeking liquid, the Chewy-Man had pulled enough of its snaking body from the now filled blood portal to reach Mike Eastley. The popping sludge in Greg's living room oozed alongside tinny screams of both the gagged Mike and the pair of regretful accomplices to Christy and the dark-haired girl in the uniform. These harrowing occurrences weren't alone, though. There were also organic snaps and groans riding through the speakers. I stopped wiping the endless drudge of sewage to gawp, struggling not to puke. The Chewy-Man's mouth had fully unhinged. The space between betoothed ridges was easily as tall as a man. I could see clearly its thick bluish tongue, could make out with horrifying clarity that the jutting rows of molars didn't stop at its gums, but extended all the way down its tunnelling gullet to the guts, presumably hidden at their end. Mike Eastley could see all of this too. I'm sure that's the reason his eyes rolled back until only 2 white pixels were visible. I'm sure that's why thin jets of puke erupted from the gasps between his lips and the bald socks. Fortunately, I didn't have to ponder how Mike Eastley was feeling for long. Those of us occupied with trying to contain the deluge from the speakers had all stopped. We watched, tears streaming from every pair of eyes, as the Chewy-Man closed his jaws around Mike Eastley's limp legs. There was a sickening crunch, a sound I can only describe as like a stack of uncooked spaghetti snapping if it was wrapped in raw bacon. Mike's puke-choked shrieks still haunt me, as do the slavering moans of the Chewy-Man as it inched its way up his unresisting body, bite by blood-soaked bite. Its jaw didn't snap shut quickly, but instead closed in slow and deliberate motions. Rather than pressing some kind of jawbone shut, the Chewy-Man instead sucked Mike Eastley further and further into its maw. The lips seemed to empty between bites, filling again with an unseen fluid every time the mouth closed around Mike Eastley's shins, knees, thighs, slowly creating the pressure needed to snap the teenage boy's bones like twigs in an industrial vice. Becky and Steph were in hysterics as the full horror of the fate they had sealed Mike Eastley to dawned on them. Even Christy had lost her passion now. She was knelt on the floor sobbing, her eagerness for Mike's demise further diminished with each sucking chew. Only the girl in the uniform remained unfazed. Her predatory grin was fixed right up until the point those shriveled eyes and puckered lips found their way to Mike's torso. It was at that exact moment the browns and yellows of puke around the sock gave way to dark purples and reds that the footage, to my eternal relief, cut out with a soft ping. I've never left a building so fast. I barely had time to hear Greg's pleas for us not to leave over the electronic and disturbingly wet and organic crunching of his TV imploding. None of us stayed. We all ran home, tears streaming down our faces, more than one pair of jeans damp. We never saw Greg or his family after that. Terry and I, as well as presumably Rob, Dan and Ricky, had asked our parents about the Chewy-Man as soon as we'd crashed through our front doors, sobbing and blubbering like lunatics. My father's response wasn't the warm, calming, parental reassurance I was expecting. "Where the fuck did you hear that name?" he'd snapped throwing me onto the sofa. You tell me now, who the fuck told you about the Chewy-Man? I, of course, explained everything to him. He left the room and I could hear through the wall between our kitchen and lounge that he was making phone calls. Angry phone calls. This lasted about half an hour before he came back, face stern, gaze never meeting mine. Listen to me. You are never to speak of the Chewy-Man again. You're also never to ask about Greg or his family again. Do you understand? You won't be seeing him around anymore. Dad, what do you... Enough. The loud smash of the glass he was carrying on the opposite wall made me jump out of my skin. Enough. Don't press it. Don't bring it up again. Forget Greg. But shut up. This also threw me. My dad was usually a gentle, soft-spoken man. To hear him address me with such venom was enough to prompt a fresh wave of tears on my cheeks. Just shut up and stay here. You boys have fucked up a lot of things for us. No. Sorry, that's not fair. Greg's dad has. But we're going to go and sort it. Sit down. Not you. We, as in Jake and Dave and your other idiot friends' dads. I'm going to be out a while. Don't be up when I get back. And this is the last conversation we're ever going to have about tonight. I didn't hear him return until 4 a.m. He shut the door behind him and sat on the stairs for a full hour sobbing. Terry had said his own dad had told him much the same. Unlike me, Terry decided to push the issue further. The black eye he showed up with to school the next day was enough to ensure I never tested my own father on his word. Sure enough, all trace of Greg and his family were gone. It's like they'd never existed. Other kids would look away awkwardly when Terry and I had the guts to ask in hushed tones, out of earshot of adults. As for the adults, from teachers to police, they'd give us the same angry glares throughout the few weeks before we gave up trying to ask. It's been a few decades since then. As I said, Dan and Ricky have sided with the town. No matter how drunk Terry and I get them, they will still swear blind they've never heard of Greg. On the few times we've tried to bring up the Chewy-Man, well, let's just say things got violent. We've tried searching every local archive we can, basically, since our first week outside of school, and the hawk-like gazes of our teachers. All searches of the Chewy-Man, Mike Eastley, or mysterious disappearances or odd happenings have turned up empty. We had to stop eventually. The police showed up at both our houses one night. That's when we had it confirmed that the town was going to the extent of monitoring our devices. It was Rob's suicide a few months ago that prompted Terry and me to move our private conversations about that night from postulating into actual action. So far we've found nothing. All we've managed to do is attract furious stares from the other inhabitants of the small town. Terry went into hiding when he kept spotting Dan waiting outside his house. This was a few weeks after we made our first posts. Before long, I'd spot Ricky outside my own, his now balding features staring up at my bedroom window, face locked in an enraged snarl. That's why I haven't told you which town I came from, where the people doing their best to suppress the truth of Chewy-Man reside. I've been hopping from place to place since then, crashing in hotels and Airbnbs for as long as I can before I start to notice the faces. You get used to them, the familiar characters, when you spend your life in the same sleepy town. I could spot the local butcher scowling at me across Piccadilly Square in a heartbeat. The old lady from 2 doors down stayed hidden on a busy Glasgow thoroughfare for all of 30 seconds. To say the hateful looks on their faces scare me would be an understatement. I wouldn't be bed hopping like this if I felt safe. I definitely wouldn't feel the need to keep the name of the town I grew up in hidden. That's for your safety, I think, as much as mine. For some reason, our entire town, including our own parents, don't want us poking around and finding out just what the hell the Chewy-Man was. Why did our fathers make Greg, his mum and dad, and 7-year-old sister vanish from the face of the earth? Why has nobody heard of the Chewy-Man? Why do we get dozens of deleted responses, no matter where we post our inquiries? Why was CM87 one of dozens of VHS in the old suitcase we found it in? And most importantly of all, why did the tapes range from CM81A all the way to CM99 Part 3? And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe and click that like button and the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. If you have any scary stories, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.